Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, and I'm joined by the Christoph.
Whoa, thank you. So nice to be pleasantly introduced.
All
Thanks
the time.
for. Oh, no, I know. You always add a little spin, a little bit different every time, and it's nice every time, I gotta say.
I do my best.
Thank you.
Picture a fleet of 8 ships, most of them merchant vessels and with gun ports cut into their sides. 3 months ago, crewed by men who have never fired a shot in anger, sailing south under a flag that didn't exist a year earlier, towards a foreign port to invade a foreign colony in the name of a country that does not yet legally exist. That's not a metaphor. That's Tuesday, March 3rd, 1776. And the country in question, the United States of America, is 4 months from being declared into existence at all. This is a story of the raid of Nassau. If you've never heard of it, you're not alone. It doesn't have the name recognition of Yorktown or Bunker Hill. There's no monument crowding out the parking lot. But this raid is where the United States Navy fought its first fleet action ever, and where the United States Marine Corps carried out its first amphibious landing ever. 2 institutions that would go on to define American military power for the next 2.5 centuries took their first steps together on a beach in the Bahamas in an operation most Americans couldn't place on a map if their life depended on it. Here's why it happened. Roll back to the fall of 1775. The Revolution is barely 6 months old. George Washington has an army outside Boston. And that army has a problem that has nothing to do with training or morale or muskets. It has a problem with powder. Washington writes to the Continental Congress that his forces have enough gunpowder for perhaps 9 rounds per man. 9. Not 9 volleys. 9 individual shots. And then the war is over, because there is nothing behind them but rocks and bayonets. Where did the powder go? Some of it went straight out from under the colonists' noses. In Virginia, the royal governor, Lord Dunmore, had already ordered his sailors to empty the gunpowder magazine in Williamsburg and haul the stores away before the colonists could seize them for themselves. That powder didn't just disappear. It went south by ship to a British colony that nobody was watching closely, New Providence Island in the Bahamas, and its capital. Nassau in 1775 is a sleepy port town. It has 2 forts guarding its harbor. Fort Nassau, sitting right in town with 46 guns on walls too weak to actually support their recoil, and Fort Montague, a smaller outer work that with 17 guns covering the harbor mouth. It has a governor, Montfort Brown, who has been explicitly warned, months in advance by British General Thomas Gage himself, that the Americans might come for what's stored there. And it has, for all that warning, almost no real defense. A governor's mansion, a skeleton garrison, a colonial militia that has never expected to fight anyone. Set this against what the fleet is actually up against. The Royal Navy in 1775 has something like 270 ships
Whoa.
in commission worldwide, crewed by tens of thousands of trained sailors, built up over a century of continuous institutional practice. The Continental Navy Congress authorizes to oppose that force amounts to 8 vessels. Most of them merchant hulls with cannon added as an afterthought. This is not a fair fight by any measure that matters, and everyone involved in ordering it knows that. It's not designed to be a fair fight. It's designed to solve one specific, desperate problem. Using a lightly armed handful of ships, nobody expects to survive a real encounter with the enemy's main strength. Into this walks the newborn Continental Navy. Congress had authorized the first ships back in October of 1775, a fleet that on paper sounds almost absurd next to the Royal Navy's hundreds of warships. Command goes to a 60-year-old Rhode Island merchant captain named Esky Hopkins, a man with decades of experience at sea and none at all commanding a battle fleet. Alongside the ships comes a brand new fighting force, authorized that same November, the Continental Marines, under a Quaker-turned-sailor named Samuel Nicholas, who had previously as much combat experience leading Marines as there have been Marines to lead, which is to say, none, because the institution is 3 months old. Congress's official orders to Hopkins are almost comically narrow. Patrol the Virginia and Carolina coastline. Harass British shipping. Come home. Nassau isn't mentioned, but there's reason to believe, and historians still argue about exactly how much reason, that Hopkins carried additional instructions, given quietly, off the official record, pointing him somewhere else entirely, toward the Bahamas, toward that undefended stockpile of British gunpowder. No, towards that undefended stockpile of British gunpowder and cannon sitting 300 miles offshore, guarded by a governor who'd been warned and did almost nothing about it. So on February 17th, 1776, 8 ships slip out of Cape Henlopen, Delaware, carrying roughly 200 Marines who have never landed anywhere, crewed by sailors who have never fought a fleet action, commanded by a merchant captain with no battle experience, sailing towards a target that isn't in their written orders, to solve a gunpowder crisis that could otherwise end the revolution before it properly begun. Nobody involved in this mission is famous yet. Not Hopkins, not Nicholas, not the 28-year-old first lieutenant standing on the deck of the flagship, Alfred, a Scotsman who will one day be called the father of the American Navy, but is, on this particular February morning, a nobody with a borrowed commission and something to prove. This raid will not go according to plan. Almost nothing about it will. And yet, by the time it's over, it will have shaped the fate of 2 of America's oldest institutions, and quietly written the first chapter of a navy the whole world would eventually have to reckon with.
This is super interesting because when you told me the date, I guess when you told us all the dates, I was like, how could this possibly be the first U.S. Navy? Because America, the colonies are still in conflict with Britain, so it doesn't make sense to me. But then as you were telling the story and unfolding, it does make sense. It's just, this is quite a dire situation that the colonists are in, and I had no idea. I guess our modern world doesn't really lend itself to as many shortages. There's less supply of some things, the prices fluctuate, and it eventually balances itself out, more or less. But given how much more primitive things were with the colonists, and I'm not saying they were primitive, period, but their supply lines and infrastructure and industry was more primitive. The availability of powder, it's not something they could turn around and say, we'll just make some more, or we'll just order some more from wherever. They're in the middle of a fight that's been going on for a year now, probably.
And they're fighting their main supplier.
Exactly. And so they have to make a bold move, and this certainly is one. Going from, it sounds like mostly New England, so Delaware area, that is quite a voyage all the way to the Bahamas. And the war could be over in the time that it takes them to go there and come back, even if they're 100% successful. So this is an act of necessity born out of desperation. And you did mention the quantity of British ships, which was overwhelming, but that also increases the randomness. How many ships will they encounter? Will they encounter 20? Will they encounter 0? They have to take the chance anyway, and that's crazy. And so I'm very excited to see how this unfolds. We are celebrating America's 250th birthday, so I'm pretty sure it goes the Americans' way, but I need to find out
But
how.
we do win it at the end, so.
In the end, yes. I guess.
Otherwise, we wouldn't have a 250th birthday.
No, that's my point. But I just want to see how it unfolds, because how much does it contribute, or how much does it hold us back, depending on the outcome of this action?
Let's back up and talk about why a raid on a sleepy Caribbean port mattered enough to risk the Continental Navy's entire existing fleet on it. Because the answer starts with a number that should stop you cold. In August of 1775, George Washington ordered an accounting of every barrel of gunpowder available to the Continental Army outside Boston. He'd been told to expect 308 barrels. The real number was 90. 90 barrels for an army trying to besiege the second largest city in British North America. Enough by the arithmetic of the time for about 9 cartridges per soldier. 9 shots. Not 9 volleys across a campaign, 9 individual rounds, and then the war stops because there is nothing left to fight it with but bayonets and rocks. Washington wrote to a friend that winter in language that reads less like a general's report and more like a man watching a house catch fire in slow motion. Quote, "Our want of powder is inconceivable, a daily waste, and no supply. Administers a gloomy prospect." This is the emergency of the Continental Congress is trying to solve when it stands up a navy at all. On October 13th, 1775, Congress authorizes the first armed vessels of what would become the United States Navy, a decision made not out of grand strategic ambition, but out of raw necessity. 6 weeks later, on November 10th, Congress creates a second new institution alongside it, the Continental Marines, raised specifically to serve as landing troops aboard those ships. Neither organization has fought a battle. Neither has a tradition, a reputation, or so much as a uniform pattern settled on. What they have is a mission handed to a 60-year-old Rhode Island merchant captain named Esky Hopkins, appointed commander-in-chief of the fleet in December of 1775. Hopkins' written orders from Congress are specific, and they do not mention Nassau at all. He is instructed to sail south, clear British naval forces from the coasts of Virginia and the Carolinas, and then turn north and do the same off Rhode Island. That's the paper record. But historians have long suspected, without ever fully proving, that Hopkins carried something else as well. Informal guidance, delivered outside the official correspondence, pointing him towards a target Congress had already identified as worth taking. Because 4 months earlier, in November of 1775, Congress had received intelligence about exactly where a large quantity of badly needed gunpowder had ended up. And it wasn't in Virginia or the Carolinas at all. It was sitting on an island governed by the British in the Bahamas. And Congress's own journal for November 29th records the order plainly. Locate that powder, and if it can be secured, bring it home. How did British gunpowder end up stockpiled on a Caribbean island in the first place? Because of a man named Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, who, sensing the colony slipping out of his control in the spring and summer of 1775, had ordered the gunpowder magazine in Williamsburg emptied and its contents shipped out of reach of the colonists entirely. Some of it went to Royal Navy ships, Some of it eventually found its way to New Providence Island and the port town of Nassau, administered by a British governor named Montfort Brown, who, by the fall of 1775, had been explicitly warned by the British General Thomas Gage himself that the Americans might come looking for it. Brown receives that warning. Brown does almost nothing with it. No reinforced garrison, no naval patrol worth mentioning, just 2 aging forts, an unreliable militia, and a governor who apparently doesn't believe a fleet from the mainland colonies would actually sail 1,000 miles to make good on the threat. This is the gap the Continental Navy is built to exploit on its very first mission. Not a glorious ship-to-ship duel, not a defense of the coastline, but a smash-and-grab raid for the one commodity that could determine whether Washington's army survives the next campaign season. And it says something about how desperate the moment actually was that Congress was willing to gamble its entire brand new Navy in its first operation. 1,000 miles from home on a target that wasn't even in the ship's official orders. Put yourself in Hopkins' position for a moment. You have 8 vessels, most of them merchantmen, hastily converted with cut gun ports and reinforced decks, not purpose-built warships like the British have. You have crews who enlisted weeks ago. You have officers who have never operated as a squadron. And you are being asked, officially or not, to sail this collection of green ships and green men to a foreign port, land an entirely new branch of the military that has never conducted a landing in its existence, and bring home a strategic resource under the nose of a defended, if poorly defended, colonial government. There's no margin in this plan for competence that you don't already have. Every single piece of it depends on men learning their jobs in real time, under fire for the first time. The exact condition every Navy in history fears most, and the exact condition the United States Navy was born into. That's the wager Congress makes in the winter of 1775 into 1776. Whether it pays off its story of the next several weeks, and it does not go the way anybody planning it in Philadelphia expected it to.
This is quite an ask from the government to these individuals, because they're not really even U.S. sailors at this point. There is no United States. But this is, like I said earlier, of utmost necessity to acquire this powder and supply it for the sake of the revolution. That's huge. I just can't get over that. How much did these guys know each other well before this? Did they have a lot of skirmishes with pirates even before this to train them up so that they're at least somehow skilled enough to do battle at sea?
No, these are merchantmen. There are no weapons on board when they're mission. And before then, British Navy took care of the pirates, not merchantmen.
This. I know that from a military perspective with the Army in the Revolution, the Minutemen and the men that showed up to fight had some experience with weapons to defend themselves against Native American raids or animals or any number of things. So they were more acquainted with weaponry than an average English citizen would have been, at least one in the mainland. This is a different story completely. Like you said, the British Navy took care of piracy. They're merchants. They're not seemingly equipped to do what they're being asked to do. And yet, we're talking about them for a reason. And so they accept. They know what's at stake. And they make the long journey down to the Bahamas to do what they can. And who knows, maybe they know this might fail, but it's worth the try. And I find that very encouraging, very impressive. So many times, I myself and probably many listeners will be asked to do something that we have no experience in, no confidence maybe in the ability to get it done, but it needs doing. So we're going to give it a go. And then by the end, you've learned how to do something a little bit better and you've accomplished a goal. And that's pretty amazing. And I got to see what happens. Please continue the story so we can find out how this unfolds.
The fleet that sails on this mission spends more time trapped in ice than it does at sea preparing for it, which tells you something about how improvised this whole operation really was. By December of 1775, 8 ships have assembled on the Delaware River at Philadelphia. The flagship Alfred, a converted merchantman now carrying roughly 30 guns under Captain Dudley Saltonstall. The Columbus under Captain Abraham Whipple, carrying close to 28. The brig's Cabot, 14 guns under Captain John Burroughs Hopkins, the Commodore's own son, and Andrew Doria, 16 guns under Captain Nicholas Biddle. The sloop Providence, 12 guns under Captain John Hazard, and 3 smaller vessels. The sloop Hornet and the schooners Wasp and Fly, rounding out the squadron with a handful of guns apiece. On paper, this is a fleet. In practice, it is 8 merchant hulls with holes cut into their sides for cannons, crewed by men who had signed on for wages and adventure and have never sailed together as a unit in their lives. They don't even get to leave on schedule. Ice on the Delaware River locks the fleet in place for roughly 6 weeks, an agonizing delay for an operation built around surprise. And during that stretch, desertion becomes as much a threat to the mission as the Royal Navy is. Sailors who signed on in a burst of revolutionary enthusiasm start quietly disappearing from ships going nowhere. By the time the ice finally breaks and the fleet works its way down to Cape Henlopen at the mouth of Delaware Bay and puts to sea on February 17th, 1776, Hopkins has already lost men he never got to use. Standing on the deck of the Alfred as she clears Cape Henlopen is a 28-year-old Scotsman serving as the ship's first lieutenant. A nobody by any measure that matters in this story. A man with a checkered past under a different name and something to prove that he has not yet had the chance to prove. His name is John Paul Jones. And on this February morning, he does something that will outlive every ship in this fleet. He hoists the Grand Union flag, the first flag flown by the United Colonies. Not yet the Stars and Stripes, but its direct ancestor, over an American warship for the first time in history. Nobody watching this moment thinks it's historic. Jones is not the story yet. He's a junior officer doing his job on a ship that isn't even the point of this cruise. The point is what's stored on a beach 1,000 miles south. There's a reason Jones is sailing under a name he wasn't born with. 3 years earlier in the Caribbean, a sailor named John Paul, no Jones yet, killed a mutinous crewman in what he always maintained was self-defense, then fled to the American colonies rather than face a colonial court he had no confidence would see it that way. He had a Jones to his name, reinvented himself as an American, and by February of 1776 has talked his way into a lieutenant's commission on the strength of his seamanship alone. Hopkins, for his part, brings his own complicated history to his command. Decades at sea that, by his own later admission, included a stretch in the Atlantic slave trade before the Revolution redirected his ambitions towards something he would call patriotic service. Neither man's past would survive close scrutiny by the standards of the cause they were now serving. Both are about to get exactly the kind of second chance the Revolution seemed to specialize in handing out. On February 14th, before the fleet even clears the Delaware, Hopkins issues standing orders to his captains. If the squadron gets separated by weather, rendezvous off Great Abaco Island in the Bahamas within 14 days. It's a wise precaution because barely into the voyage, a storm does exactly what storms do to inexperienced crews sailing unfamiliar ships in close formation. The Hornet and the Fly foul their rigging together in heavy weather. Hornet takes damage to her masts and yards, severe enough that she has to peel off and limp back towards port, out of the operation entirely before it starts. Fly is delayed, separated from the main body, and won't rejoin the fleet until the raid is already over. Hopkins is down to 6 ships before he's even reached the target, and he presses on anyway. A decision that tells you something about how little slack this mission had been built into it from the start. The remaining 6 ships reach Great Abaco Island on March 1st. Here, the fleet catches a piece of good fortune and a piece of bad fortune in the same afternoon. The good fortune? They intercept 2 small Loyalist-owned sloops in local waters, and Hopkins presses their captains into service as pilots. Men who actually know these reefs and channels, which the American crews decidedly do not. The bad fortune? Governor Montfort Brown, back in Nassau, receives word that an American fleet has been sighted in the islands, carried to him by a local ship's captain named George Dorset, who makes the run from Abaco to Nassau specifically to raise the alarm. Some accounts instead credit warning to one of the captured sloop's captains, who may have slipped away from his American captors before the raid began. The record isn't fully settled on exactly who tipped Brown off, only that somebody did, and that his warning reaches Nassau before Hopkins' fleet does. Whichever version is accurate, Brown now knows Americans are coming. What he does with that warning, which is to say almost nothing, is the next part of this story. But understand where things stand as March begins. A green American fleet, already down 2 ships to weather and accidents, commanded by men who have never fought together, is bearing down on a port whose governor has just been tipped off that they're on the way. Neither side at this point has any idea how badly the next 72 hours are actually going to go for both of them.
I can't get over. As soon as you said the name John Paul Jones, I'm like, ho, this is going to go better than it probably should have. And then as you continue to tell his story as well as his captains, America at this time, the colonies, are a pretty good refuge for folks in England specifically, but from other places as well, just not as big of a proportion, that are either have nothing where they're from or are fleeing some trouble or any combination of things, and they're seeking a better life and have the audacity to do it. This is not a small trip across the ocean. This is pretty punishing. It's
extremely dangerous.
Something that, it takes a lot of courage to not only leave your homeland in and of itself, but to traverse an ocean where the technology isn't quite perfected yet, and you could be lost at sea forever.
It's not
you
perfected.
Could die.
You could still be lost at sea forever.
At least now we have a lot of weather tracking technology with satellites, and we have radar. We have some additional tools to help the journey to be safer, as well as, I would say, stronger vessels replete with, what are those ships called in an emergency? The little ships, the little boats on the side, not rescue boats. Help me out here.
Ribs?
You're looking at me. No, let's say you're on a cruise and you hit an iceberg, we'll say, and they say, go to the little boats that can save you. Lifeboats. There we go. Man, that was an unnecessarily long journey to get to the word lifeboat.
But it was so fun.
Anyway, I'm so glad you enjoyed it. I will say not perfected, you're right. Things can still go wrong. But back then, this is 250 years ago, a lot more dangerous. And people that had the kind of courage or energy to make their way to the colonies are contributing to the audacity of that society. There's a lot of risk takers that came to the colonies for one reason or another, and as a result, their children and their children's children have an inordinate amount of audacity and sometimes maybe impulsivity or lack of self-control in some capacities. But in a way, you said it yourself. The sailors that were embarking on this adventure were like, yeah, you know what? We could go for some pay and some adventure is what we're looking for. If you're looking for adventure, there's a number of ways to do that. But I think sailing 1,000 miles to a place that of questionable defense, maybe it's incredibly defended, maybe it's not defended very well at all, but we're going to go anyway. And yeah, we don't know each other. And oh, these cannons on these ships, they're new. They're not really designed for this, but we're still going to go. And who knows? Maybe we'll be successful, but what a night it'll be. Let's go. That's not rational, I don't think, but it is exciting. And I think it's that spirit that America still has to a large degree that allows for innovation or exploration or shooting fireworks out of a motorcycle while you're holding a wheelie for 2 minutes. That's pretty awesome. And so I get it. I still don't think it's a great idea, but maybe that's more on me. Maybe it's, hey, just a bunch of guys out for a sail.
Here's where the plan falls apart for the first time. And it falls apart almost immediately, in a way that would be funny if the stakes weren't so serious. The plan as Hopkins and his captains worked it out. Straightforward on paper. The 200-odd Continental Marines and roughly 50 additional sailors assigned to the landing force are transferred onto the 2 captured Loyalist sloops and the sloop Providence. Smaller, shallower draft vessels, better suited for slipping into Nassau's harbor than the big frigates. Those 3 ships, screened by the schooner Wasp, are to sail directly into the harbor at daybreak on March 3rd. Land the Marines before the town is even awake, and seize control of both the powder and the person of Governor Brown before organized resistance can form. Speed and surprise are the entire plan. Take those away, and there is no plan. They lose both almost instantly.
Oh no.
As the 3 ships approach in the gray early light of March 3rd, lookouts on shore spot them. The record isn't clear on whether it was simple bad luck or Brown's advance warning paying off, but either way, the alarm goes up before a single Marine sets foot on land. Brown, roused out of bed, orders 4 guns fired from Fort Nassau to alert the militia scattered across the island. It's meant to be a show of readiness. Instead, it becomes a small embarrassment in its own right. 2 of the 4 guns come off their mounts when they're fired.
Oh.
The fort's decrepit condition announcing itself before the Americans have even engaged. But the noise does its job. The element of surprise, the one thing this entire operation was built around, is gone in the first 10 minutes. Picture the scene from the deck of one of those 3 approaching ships. Dawn breaking over unfamiliar water. A beach and a fort silhouetted ahead. And then, without warning, the flat crack of cannon fire from a target you're supposed to catch asleep. For men who have never been shot at in their lives, that's the exact moment training either holds or doesn't. There's no way to know in advance which it'll be. And the honest answer is that on this particular morning, nobody gets the chance to find out, because the attack breaks off before it can be tested. Nicholas and the American commanders make the only sound call available to them. They abort. Rather than press an assault that's already lost the advantage of surprise into a harbor defended by forts whose actual strength nobody has confirmed, the landing force pulls back and rejoins the rest of the fleet at Handover Sound, roughly 6 nautical miles east of town. It is by any measure the correct decision, and it is also, for a brand new fighting force on its very first operation, a genuinely difficult one to make. Pulling back under pressure, with the enemy alerted and your own men keyed up for a fight that didn't happen, takes a different kind of discipline than pressing forward does. Nobody talks about that kind of discipline in the history of books. It matters anyway. At Hanover Sound, Hopkins calls a council of war aboard the flagship. And here the historical record gets genuinely murky in a way worth addressing directly rather than smoothing over. Popular accounts, including some written well after the fact, credit the young lieutenant, John Paul Jones, with proposing the corrected landing site that ultimately worked, and with personally leading the second assault. It's a good story, and it's the version that tends to survive in retellings, because Jones later becomes famous enough that everything he touched gets remembered more vividly than everything around him. But the naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison, who wrote what's still considered the definitive biography of Jones, pushes back hard on this version. Jones, Morrison points out, had no particular familiarity with these waters. The men who did were captains like Cabot's Lieutenant Thomas Weaver, who'd actually operated in Bahamian waters before and who may well be the real source of the plan that follows. This isn't a case of one source being right and another being wrong, so much as a case of a legend outrunning the evidence. And it's worth saying so plainly rather than repeating the more flattering version just because it's the one people want to be true. Whoever actually drew it up, the new plan is simple and, this time, sound. Land the force somewhere the fort's guns can't reach and the town's lookouts won't immediately spot. Then march overland rather than sailing straight into the harbor mouth. The target this time is the stretch of coastline south and east of Fort Montagu, out of the direct light of the fort's cannons, close enough for a workable march, quiet enough that surprise might still be salvageable even after the morning's near disaster. It's a second chance for an operation that came within one lucky lookout of falling apart entirely on day one. What happens next is where this raid actually starts to matter, not just to the men involved, but to the two institutions that are about to discover in real time what they're capable of.
I do fall victim to a lot of propaganda, maybe is the right word, but the nice versions of our history. And I previously would have readily accepted, oh, clearly John Paul Jones knew what he was doing and proposed a site, and that's why it was a success. Why wasn't he in charge in the first place?
And you pretty much did state that earlier.
Yep. No, he has one of the best responses to utter defeat that I've ever heard, where he's from a sinking ship. I think it's the Battle of Flamborough. And they're like, so are you ready to give up? And the ship is sinking below him. And he says, I have not yet begun to fight. And then he ends up winning. And so that alone, to me, is a pretty substantial resume builder, we'll say. But yeah, like when I was young, the George Washington not telling a lie about chopping the cherry tree down. You know what? Probably didn't happen. But it does make George Washington an honorable man in that story. And he may have been honorable, but we don't need this story. Let's just talk about the truth of what is. And one of the things I like about this podcast quite a bit is how you explore, for better or worse, what happened. What is the best we can gather as far as what happened? How did the people actually respond to these events? And what changed as a result of these actions? And so, honestly, John Paul Jones, in my mind, he's done some pretty rad stuff. He doesn't need to be the hero in this story, but what did happen and how were the Americans successful? You stated very clearly that the two elements they had on their side, surprise and the other one, I think it was speed, because they were so few ships, were totally negated. And they have to come up with something, and they do. And not only does it seem to work, but it's brilliant. Put the ship somewhere the guns can't reach. Approach from a place the lookouts aren't looking. And that can help. And there's only so many places these defenders can be watching, and only so many defenders that can be defending. And so they're rolling the dice anyway, like this journey all the way down here. but it seems like they're taking it to the next level. It's, you know what? Let's just do this march. In the Bahamas, I guess it's still springtime, so it's probably not swelteringly hot, but I'm amazed that they're doing this, given that many of them are unfamiliar with this place completely. But here we go. It's what needs done, so they're doing it.
The second landing goes almost nowhere near as badly, which, given how the morning went, is its own kind of achievement. Between roughly noon and 2 in the afternoon on March 3rd, the three ships carrying the landing force, the two captured sloops, and the Providence, with Wasp standing by to provide covering fire if needed, put the Marines and sailors ashore south and east of Fort Montagu, out of range of the fort's guns and away from the town's immediate line of sight. The landing meets no resistance at all. 200 Marines and 50 sailors, under the command of Captain Samuel Nicholas, step up onto a beach in the Bahamas without a shot fired in either direction. Nicholas himself is an unlikely choice to lead the Marine Corps' first combat operation. Weeks earlier, he was running a Philadelphia tavern. Tun Tavern, by tradition, the very building where the Continental Marines were first recruited back in November of 1775, pouring drinks for some of the same men he'd shortly be leading into a foreign harbor. He has no formal military training of any kind. What he has is Congress's confidence, a commission, and roughly 200 volunteers who signed up over the preceding 3 months with even less preparation than he has. Sit with that for a second, because it's easy to blow past it in the retelling. This is the first amphibious landing in the history of what will become the United States Marine Corps, an institution that will go on to storm beaches at places like Tarawa and Iwo Jima and Incheon, an institution whose entire identity is built around exactly this kind of operation, ship-to-shore assault under fire. And its first ever attempt at it is quiet, undramatic, nobody shooting at anybody. If you'd told the Marines waiting ashore that afternoon that they were founding a tradition that would define American warfare over the next 2.5 centuries, they'd have had no way to know it. They were just relieved nobody was shooting. That doesn't mean nothing happened. As the landing force organizes itself and begins moving towards Fort Montagu, a British officer, a lieutenant named Burke, commanding whatever scratch of garrison that fort actually has, leads a small detachment out to investigate. He takes one look at the size of the force he's up against and does the only sensible thing available to him. He sends out a flag of truce rather than engaging. He was like, nope. Through that parlay, the British learn exactly what the Americans are after. Not the town, not its people, just the powder and the military stores. It's a strange, almost business-like exchange for what's supposed to be an act of war. Burke reports back. Governor Brown, meanwhile, arrives at the fort himself with roughly 80 additional militiamen. Takes one look at the scale of the American landing force bearing down on him, ordered a few of the fort's guns fired, more gesture than defense at this point, and pulls almost all of his men back towards town rather than risk a fight he has no realistic chance of winning. Most of the militia simply go home. There will be no battle for Fort Montagu. There will barely even be a skirmish. Nicholas's men occupy the fort that evening and settle in to wait out the night, still consulting among themselves on the next move when Burke returns a second time under another flag of truce. This time explicitly asking what the command officer of the enemy intends to do next. The Americans repeat themselves. They've come for the powder and the arms, and they're prepared to advance on the town itself if that's what it takes. Consider what's actually happening in that exchange, because it's easy to read past it as procedural. Two forces that have never fought a war before, a Continental Marine Corps, 3 months old, and a colonial militia that has never mobilized for anything more serious than a hurricane, are negotiating the terms of a fight neither one particularly wants, through a lieutenant walking back and forth under a white flag as if the outcome were already understood by everyone involved. In a sense, it was. Nobody in Nassau signed up to die defending a governor's warehouse, and nobody in the American landing force particularly wanted to force the issue if it didn't have to come to that. War, even in its opening chapters, runs as much on this kind of quiet mutual calculation as it does on gunfire. It's not what it takes. Brown, faced with that answer and with a militia that has already demonstrated it isn't interested in fighting, makes the decision that will define the rest of this raid. Not a decision to resist, but a decision to try to save what he can before the Americans get their hands on it. That decision, what Brown does at night with the gunpowder actually stored inside Fort Nassau under cover of darkness, while Nicholas's Marines sleep in a fort 60 miles away, is the pivot point of this entire operation. Because for all the drama of the morning's aborted landing and all the historical weight of that quiet, unopposed beach assault, the raid's actual objective is about to slip through Hopkins' fingers in a way that has nothing to do with British resistance and everything to do with a mistake the Americans make themselves.
I find this very interesting, the whole negotiation bit. I know that for at least a century in this area, a lot of the colonies or cities that were established by the European powers in the Bahamas were under a lot of threat, either from pirates or from other European nations that they were at war with. So, for example, the French cities, if they're at war with England, which they usually were, they were under threat from the English all the time. And so to have a British city in the Bahamas where the governor is responsible for the people, but also the industry that it provides, to have a foreign power come in and threaten the city, his responsibility is to protect the people, everything, the British interest there. And so talking and understanding what they needed was the best course of action, I think, clearly, instead of just trying to repel them, especially when your defenses are as shoddy as these ended up being. When you said that some of the cannons fell off their mounts, you're in a bad situation, but you don't need to communicate that or telegraph that to the enemy. Understanding what they want, seeing if there's some kind of solution that you can come to and still maintain the integrity of what the crown has put you in charge of is certainly something that should be pursued. But you also don't want to just roll over and give the enemy what they want, especially when they're actively engaging in a conflict. And this powder arrived very recently with the express desire to keep it from the colonists, the rebels. And so how would he be punished, or how would he go down in history if he just went ahead and enabled the colonists to fight the crown? That would not go well for him. So what he does next, which you alluded to, I think is probably his only course of action, or at least something that is enough for him to be able to say, I did my best in trying to keep this from our enemy. So, but I want to hear some more details. So go ahead, Dale.
Here's the part of this story that ought to make anyone with actual naval experience wince. Because it's not bad luck, and it's not British cunning. It's a basic operational failure that any junior officer standing picket duty today would recognize immediately. New Providence's Islands Harbor has two ways in and out: an eastern channel near Fort Montague, where Hopkins had anchored the bulk of his fleet and where his landing force went ashore, and a western channel on the opposite side of the harbor, closer to town. Any competent blockade, and blockading a harbor is not an exotic or advanced naval skill, it is one of the most basic tasks a fleet can be assigned, requires covering both. Hopkins covers one, the Western Channel, The whole time his ships sit at anchor off Fort Montagu is left completely open. Nobody is watching it. Not a picket boat. Not a single armed sloop. Nothing. This isn't a subtle error that only a trained eye would catch. Covering both entrances to a harbor you intend to blockade is about as basic as naval doctrine gets. It's taught before you're taught almost anything else about controlling an anchorage. Because the entire point of a blockade is denying every avenue of movement. Not most of them. A green militia officer might be forgiven for not knowing that. A Continental Navy Commodore with decades of merchant sailing experience behind him does not have that excuse. Whether it was overconfidence, unfamiliarity with the specific geography of this harbor, or simply too much attention paid to the fight that never happened at Fort Montagu, and not enough to the one that could still slip past him, Hopkins leaves the back door of Nassau Harbor, standing wide open at the exact moment it mattered most. Governor Montfort Brown figures this out, or gets lucky enough to guess it on the night of March 3rd. That evening, with his militia already melting away and Nicholas's Marines dug in at Fort Montagu, Brown convenes a council of war with the town's leading citizens inside Nassau. The military situation is hopeless. Everyone in that room understands that Nassau itself cannot be defended. But the powder is a different question. And Brown makes the decision that, whatever else you think of the man, shows he understood exactly what mattered most about this raid. He orders the gunpowder stored inside Fort Nassau, loaded onto ships, and run for open water, specifically for St. Augustine in British East Florida, well outside the reach of Hopkins' fleet. At midnight, under cover of darkness, Nassau's own citizens and militia haul barrel after barrel of powder down to the waterfront and load it aboard two vessels. The small merchant ship Mississippi Packet, which takes on 119 barrels, and the armed guard ship HMS St. John, which takes 43 more. That's 162 barrels total out of 200 stored in the fort. Loaded in the dark in a matter of hours by a defeated garrison that by every other measure had already given up. At 2 o'clock in the morning, both ships slip out of Nassau Harbor through that unwatched western channel and make for the open sea, bound for Florida, sailing directly past a fleet that never posted so much as a rowboat to stop them. Nobody on the American side notices until it's far too late to matter. By the time Hopkins' Marines march unopposed into Nassau the next morning, more than 80% of the very cargo this entire operation was built around is already gone. Spirited away not through British tactical brilliance, not through some daring feat of seamanship, but through a hole in the American blockade that should never have existed in the first place. This is the kind of failure that doesn't make it into the celebratory version of a story. It's not dramatic. There's no battle attached to it. It's just a fleet commander who forgot to cover his own back door, and it cost the mission the one thing it actually came for. Understand what that means in practical terms. Washington's army at this exact moment is still counting cartridges. The Congress authorized this entire expedition, gambled its brand new Navy and its brand new Marine Corps on a 1,000-mile voyage, specifically to relieve that shortage. And the largest single share of that powder that could have gone a long way towards solving it sails calmly out of reach at 2 in the morning because nobody thought to watch a channel that any chart of the harbor would have shown was there. It's worth sitting with that unglamorous truth of this moment rather than rushing past it towards the parts of the story that feel more like victory. War doesn't run on drama. It runs on logistics, attention to unglamorous detail, and the discipline to cover every avenue of approach, even when nothing seems to be happening there. Hopkins' fleet wins this raid in every way that will end up in the history books, and loses in a single overlooked channel most of what actually mattered about it. It's a mistake that costs nothing in blood and nearly everything in purpose. The quietest, least dramatic failure of the entire expedition, and arguably its most consequential.
I can't believe that. I thought for sure it was a done deal. But you're right. If you leave a path of egress to the enemy, they will take it. And especially once you've communicated, hey, we're just here for this. And your intentions are, we don't need to spill blood. We're not trying to capture the town or extend the reach of the colonies into the Bahamas. We just want this, and then we'll be on our way. But then that is the very thing that the governor is able to take from you, to scurry away. And you don't notice until, like you said, it's too late. I did notice the count was, they didn't put all the powder in there, so I assumed that maybe some of it was still captured. But you can elaborate in a little bit. I think that could have gone such a long way. And I really find it important that you've detailed this operational failure. Again, these are not trained professional sailors. They're just merchants. This is not...
Merchants are professional sailors.
Professional military is what I'm trying to say.
Then say it like that.
So, yeah. Here we go. Professional... They're not professional military members. They are professional sailors. That is a good bit of discernment. Thank you for that. And apologies to all you sailors out there who may have found offense that I don't take you seriously. I do. I just didn't say it right. So, which brings me to the point that the Americans made this mistake. Just like I made that mistake with the way I said it, but in both cases, it can be learned from and improved upon. And in subsequent or previous episodes, and also I'm sure subsequent episodes, we will cover how the Navy adapts to operational defeat. Whether it's a military loss or something like this, where there wasn't like a hot battle, but still the objective was lost. And how does the Navy learn from that? Doesn't just pity itself or say, oh, shucks, we should have done this better. They go and do it better next time. And it's that kind of adaptability and growth that allows for operational excellence and being able to get it right the next time. So I'll learn. That's the point of what I'm trying to say. I'll learn not to insult the listeners and yourself.
It's a good lesson.
I think so.
By the morning of March 4th, 1776, there is nothing left in Nassau capable of stopping the Americans, and both sides knew it. Overnight, Hopkins has a leaflet circulated through the town, a direct message from the American commander to the civilian population. And it's worth hearing in something close to its original language, because it tells you exactly what kind of operation this was meant to be. It reads, "The reasons of my landing an armed force on the island is in order to take possession of the powder and warlike stores belonging to the crown. And if I am not opposed in putting my design in execution, the persons and property of the inhabitants shall be safe. Neither shall they be suffered to be hurt in case they make no resistance." This is not a proclamation of conquest. It's closer to a business proposition. Don't fight us, and nobody gets hurt. Given how thoroughly the town's own governor has already demonstrated he isn't interested in fighting, it's an easy offer to accept. Nicholas's Marines march into Fort Nassau and the town itself that morning without a shot fired. A delegation of the town's own leading citizens meets them part way, formally handing over the keys to Nassau. The closest thing this raid produces to an actual ceremonial surrender. It's a strange scene to picture. The first offensive operation ever conducted by the United States Navy and Marine Corps, ending not with a climatic battle, but with local officials politely handing over civic keys to a landing party that, by this point, everyone understands has already lost the one prize, the bulk of the gunpowder, it actually came for. Governor Montfort Brown does not fare nearly as well as his town does. He's placed under arrest and brought aboard the flagship Alfred as a prisoner. Brown would later complain bitterly about his treatment, writing that he was hauled away like, quote, a felon to the gallows. Strong language for a man who, by most accounts of the raid, is treated with the ordinary correctness expected for a captured colonial governor, rather than subjected to anything resembling real cruelty. It's worth taking Brown's complaint seriously enough to examine rather than dismissing it outright. He is, after all, a governor being marched off his own island in chains by men who, 4 months from now, will be citizens of a country that doesn't yet exist. Whatever the specifics of his treatment, the psychological reality of that moment, losing your post, your authority, and your freedom in the space of 48 hours to an enemy force you were explicitly warned about and did almost nothing to stop, is its own kind of reckoning, deserved or not. It's worth remembering, too, that Brown will be back, exchanged for an American general within the year. He returns to a colonial career that outlasts this humiliation by nearly a decade. A reminder that for most of the men on both sides of this raid, this is one chapter in a much longer life, not the defining one. Over the next 2 weeks, Hopkins' fleet settles into what amounts as a methodical, unhurried looting operation. Though looting undersells how organized it actually is. American sailors and Marines strip both forts of everything that can be moved. 88 cannon between Fort Nassau and Fort Montague, 15 mortars, thousands of rounds of shot, powder horns, gun carriages, and the 24 remaining casks of gunpowder that Brown's midnight evacuation didn't manage to save. They confiscate food as well. The fleet's own supplies are running low after weeks at sea, and they recover 3 previously captured American merchant vessels that had been sitting in Nassau's harbor as prizes of the Royal Navy, restoring them to their original owner's side of the ledger. Hopkins even presses a local ship, the Endeavor, into American service simply to carry the sheer volume of captured material back north. Put that haul in perspective. 88 cannon is not a trivial number for an army that, at that exact moment, is desperately short of heavy ordnance to face a Royal Navy and a British Army equipped with all the artillery an empire can produce. Whatever this raid failed to deliver in gunpowder, it delivers a genuine and immediate boost to the Continental Army's ability to actually fight a siege or hold a fortified position. Guns that will, within months, be finding their way into American hands on the mainland. It is materially a genuine haul. 88 cannon alone would meaningfully strengthen the Continental Army's artillery train, at a moment when American forces are chronically short of heavy guns as well as powder. But 2 weeks sitting still in a tropical harbor with a fleet full of green, cramped, poorly provisioned sailors produces its own casualties. And by the time Hopkins is ready to sail for home, disease has swept through his ship, hard enough that more than 140 men are on the sick list. A silent, unglamorous cost that never shows up in the tally of guns and mortars, but very nearly forces the fleet to abandon its own prizes rather than risk losing the men needed to sail them. On March 17th, with Brown and a dozen other captured colonial officials locked below decks as prisoners of war, Hopkins finally gives the order to sail for home. The hardest fighting of this entire operation, the fighting nobody back in Philadelphia is expecting, is still 3 weeks away.
That is an impressive haul. I thought this venture was just going to be a disappointment after you said that most of the prize had left in the middle of the night. I'm like, ooh, strategically, that was very clever of the governor. And I think the governor's treatment when he was complaining about it was just a matter of, I'm used to elevated positions, and this is not one of them, so I'm going to hyperbolize my situation. Yeah, don't worry, buddy. You could have been tarred and feathered or worse. And what you made me think of was the constitutional amendment about prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment and why it's there. The reason that is in the Bill of Rights in the American Constitution is because this was an era where cruel and unusual punishments happened often and were employed by the British Crown. So there were a number of things that could have happened, as did happen to Americans during this time. The fact that they weren't, I think, was a testament to, hey, we've been where you are, and we don't want to treat you the way we've been treated. And I appreciate that as an American. Gosh, 88 cannons, that's incredible. And all the shot and all the food, and that is quite a haul. So I think it's interesting that what instigated this raid yielded something very different and very helpful for the cause of liberty in America. And the fact that there was no gunfire exchanged, wonderful. It saved that much more powder. But again, like you said, the stores of food depleted, the disease that is spreading, that's a real thing. And trying to come back with 2 additional ships, and then that were prize ships, and then a third just to haul all the stuff that you got, and being spread so thin that, hey, we might need to abandon some of this just because our men are not doing well. That's a tough decision. You've come all that way to be so successful in a way, but the men are important, and that is the most important, and they're willing to just abandon a ship to make sure the men are okay, and I find that commendable. Other militaries would not do that. And so little snippets of the mindset that we get the insight to here helps us understand who we are and what we value. And I'm encouraged. So, what happens next?
If you only remember one image from this entire episode, make it this one. 7 American warships, homeward bound with their prize cargo and their prisoners, running straight into a single British frigate and losing the fight. The voyage north starts well enough. On April 4th, the fleet captures HMS Hawke, a small armed vessel carrying additional military stores, and the following day takes another prize, the Bolton, loaded with more supplies, including a welcome
Wow.
handful of extra gunpowder casks. 2 easy captures, no resistance worth mentioning, and Hopkins' fleet is riding about as high as it has at any point in this expedition. Then on April 6th, in the waters off Block Island, Rhode Island, lookouts spot a sail that turns out to belong to HMS Glasgow, a British 6th-rate frigate carrying roughly 20 guns, alone with no support in sight. On paper, this should not even be a contest. Hopkins had 7 vessels bearing down on 1. But paper doesn't account for the fact that Glasgow's crew is a trained, disciplined Royal Navy ship's company that has spent years learning to fight together, while the American fleet is still 7 weeks into its first cruise. Exactly what it was at Cape Henlopen, a squadron of green crews on hastily converted merchantmen who have never coordinated a fleet action against a real opponent. That gap in experience shows immediately. Glasgow opens fire and starts putting broadside after broadside into the nearest American ships, with a precision the Continental crews simply cannot match. The brig Cabot, closing to engage, takes the worst of it, hammered badly enough to be put out of the fight. Her captain, John Burroughs Hopkins, the Commodore's own son, wounded in the exchange. The flagship Alfred moves up to support Cabot and takes damage of her own, badly enough that her wheel ropes are shot away as she briefly loses steering control, drifting exposed under fire until her crew can rig emergency steering. For a genuinely uncomfortable stretch of this engagement, a single Royal Navy frigate, outnumbered 7-1, is inflicting far more damage than she's taking. at doing it against the entire assembled combat power of the United States Navy in its first fleet action. Eventually, seeing no realistic path to victory against those numbers, no matter how badly she's outperforming them, Glasgow's captain makes the correct call and disengages, sailing clear, undamaged but essentially intact, escaping into Newport Harbor to report the encounter. The Americans, bruised and unable to run her down, let her go. One American Marine lieutenant aboard the fleet, John Trevett, would later sum up the entire expedition. Powder lost, prize taken, a fight nearly lost against a single outgunned frigate, with a kind of weary understatement that captures the mood better than any dry casualty count could. Quote, "A grand cruise," he wrote, "and I am glad it ended so well." That's not the language of triumph. It's the language of men who knew exactly how much worse this could have gone, and are simply relieved to have come out of it the other side. The cost of this fight falls almost entirely on the American side. 11 men are killed in the engagement, with more wounded. The precise toll varies slightly depending on which secondary account you consult, but 11 dead is the figure that appears most consistently. Among them is a young Marine officer named Lieutenant John Fitzpatrick, commander of the Marine detachment aboard Cabot, the ship that took the worst of Glasgow's fire. His death makes him, as best the historical record can establish, the first Marine ever killed in combat in the history of what would become the United States Marine Corps. Sit with the shape of that for a second, because it inverts everything you might expect from this story. The landing at Fort Montague, the actual amphibious assault, the operation that makes military history as the Marine Corps' first ever ship-to-shore landing, costs nothing. Not one American casualty. The first Marine to die in combat doesn't fall storming a beach or scaling a fort wall. He dies aboard ship in a lopsided gunnery duel against a single outnumbered British frigate on the way home from a mission that has already, by this point, accomplished most of what it set out to do. That is not the version of this story that gets told in the recruiting posters. It's the truer one. There's a broader lesson here about what the Green Crews actually look like under fire, one that has nothing to do with courage and everything to do with the accumulated muscle memory that only comes from years of drill. Gun crews load, aim, and fire in a rhythm they've practiced hundreds of times. The American crews are doing all of this for the first time. In the dark, on ships some of them have served aboard for less than 2 months. That gap doesn't close in a single cruise. It closes over years. Years the Continental Navy is only just beginning to accumulate. Hopkins brings his battered fleet into New London, Connecticut on April 8th. Home, technically, victorious, carrying 88 cannon and the Bahamas' former governor in chains, and also carrying 11 dead and a damaged flagship that let a single British frigate escape a battle it had no business surviving. Word of both halves of that story is about to reach Philadelphia at the same time, and Congress will not be kind about the second half.
Those guys wanted an adventure, and I think that properly can be defined as an adventure. Capturing a governor, it's significant, and I wonder, what is the procedure? And I don't know if this fell into your training. If you have a captured, not necessarily head of state, but a person of interest that the enemy is trying to get back, and the enemy starts firing upon you, presumably to get that person back, is there some kind of code or procedure or convention that dictates where the prisoner should be so that they're out of the line of fire? So that they could be used maybe as a potential bargaining chip or something, or they're not killed by their own side as they're attacking you, or is that just luck?
Well, first of all, the British didn't know they were there. It was just one warship going home from their own mission. They just stumbled upon this fleet. So this wasn't a rescue operation. But
okay.
The prisoners would be kept in a secure place on a naval vessel. There's going to be a brig that they would be kept at. If not, it'll
Hmm.
be any place that they can be easily controlled.
I
And
see.
no, there would not be a special out of place where they would not get hurt. There are plenty of stories, especially during World War II, where the Japanese actually used prison ships in convoys to try to use them as a don't fire at us because you'll be killing your own people.
I see. Like a psychological
Yeah.
move.
And unfortunately,
Hmm.
lots and lots and lots of prisoners of war were killed by their own side because of that.
Ah, that stinks. So, with going back to the Glasgow, it's returning from some operation. It stumbles across this fleet of ships. How does it know that they are, and maybe I missed this, is it the Americans that initiate the attack? Because they're flying under a brand new flag that doesn't quite exist. Or does the Glasgow recognize them as rebellious colonials and by order of the crown must engage?
Well, no, the Glasgow, if they had a choice, would never have engaged. There's a fleet
Okay.
versus one boat. I don't care how
Right.
experienced and how confident you are. You see that, you're not going to engage. No, the Americans, or the about to be Americans, made
Right.
that decision to go after the Glasgow. I mean, they already taken 2 prizes on the return trip.
Yeah, I guess why not? On the trip
Yeah.
back, plus the two they found in the
Hmm.
harbor.
So why not go after it?
That's
And they just stumbled into a situation they couldn't handle, which would
right.
not be repeated later in the next time they go to war with the British.
Yep. It seems like one of those hard lessons that you learn.
Yeah, because by that second
All
war,
right. Well, yeah, that's
we're much more experienced, and the British are quite
yes.
surprised by how our gunnery skills.
I think, but again, it comes back to moments like this where, oh yeah, we've taken these ships, we'll take that ship, and then understanding even though you're outnumbering them from a ship, you're many more ships to the one, the discipline and the gunnery just devastated them, and I'm sure the captain had to sit with that when he is the one that said, "Oh yeah, we'll go after them," and then he has to pay the consequence for the men and material lost.
That's war.
So, how does it wrap up? How does it end? How does it? I assume these cannons and these material are a bit of a godsend to the effort.
Well, here's the uncomfortable truth about how this raid gets remembered in Philadelphia in the weeks after it ends. The part that makes military history. The first Marine amphibious landing. The first Navy fleet action. The powder and cannon hauled home. Barely registers next to the part that looks like failure. Word reaches
Hmm.
Congress of two things almost simultaneously: a successful raid that seized real material, and a humiliating near miss in what in which 7 American ships couldn't run down and capture a single badly outnumbered British frigate. Congress focuses overwhelmingly on the second part. An investigation opens in May of 1776, and by July, Hopkins and his senior captains are summoned to Philadelphia to explain themselves in person. The criticism isn't limited to the Glasgow fight. Congressman Benjamin Harrison of Virginia points out accurately that Hopkins never patrolled the Virginia and Carolina coastline he was explicitly ordered to patrol, and that he never consulted the Naval Committee about where the captured cannon and supplies should be distributed, instead, routing much of it directly to Connecticut's governor. A decision that reads as either poor judgment or an attempt to curry favor outside the proper chain of command. On who, you ask. Other members, Roger Sherman and Stephen Hopkins of Connecticut, no relation, defended the Commodore, arguing that avoiding a suicidal fight against the Royal Navy's main strength was simple good sense, and that the Nassau raid's real material haul speaks for itself. The hearing itself, held in Philadelphia in July, is, by all accounts, a uncomfortable spectacle. A fleet commander and his senior captain standing before the body that commissioned them, defending decisions made 1,000 miles away and weeks in the past. While congressmen who have never commanded so much as a rowboat second guess judgment calls made in real time under genuine uncertainty. It's a pattern that will repeat itself throughout American military history. Political oversight of wartime decisions, exercised after the fact by people who were not there and cannot fully recover what the moment actually felt like. Sometimes that oversight catches real negligence. Sometimes it simply punishes bad luck dressed up as bad judgment. In Hopkins' case, historians still argue about which this was. Either way, the fleet that made naval history in the Bahamas returned home to find its reputation adjudicated, not on a battlefield, but in a committee room. The most immediate consequence falls not on Hopkins, but on one of his captains, John Hazard, commanding the sloop Providence during the Glasgow engagement, faces a court-martial in May of 1776 on charges brought by his own subordinate officers. Accusations that include neglect of duty during the fight. The court convicts him and orders him to surrender his commission. On May 10th, 1776, his replacement takes command of Providence with the temporary rank of captain. The same young lieutenant who hoisted the Grand Union flag off Cape Henlopen back in February. The same officer whose actual role in the Fort Montagu landing plan remains disputed by historians. John Paul Jones gets his first independent command directly out of the wreckage of this raid's most embarrassing failure. The opening of a career that will eventually make him the most famous naval officer of the entire Revolution. It's worth noting plainly, the man history remembers best for this story. It's worth noting plainly, the man history remembers best from this story wasn't the mission's architect or its hero. He was a junior officer who happened to be in the right place when someone else's court-martial created an opening. Hopkins' own reputation does not recover as cleanly. Congress formally censures him on August 16, 1776, barely 5 months after Nassau, for his conduct during the expedition and its aftermath. Then, separately and more seriously, reports begin circulating that Hopkins had mistreated British prisoners of war under his authority. Allegations serious enough that in the winter of 1777, 10 Continental Navy officers, including a young midshipman named Samuel Shaw and a third lieutenant named Richard Mervyn, meet in secret aboard the frigate Warren to discuss what they've witnessed and what, if anything, they're obligated to do about it. They chose to report Hopkins' conduct to the Continental Congress. Congress suspends Hopkins from active command on March 26, 1777. Hopkins' response to being reported by his own officers is where this story takes its darkest and, in a strange way, most important turn. Rather than accepting the consequences of the accusation, Hopkins, now a private citizen with political connections still intact in Rhode Island, sues Shaw and Marvin for criminal libel in Rhode Island state courts. Criminal libel in 1778 is not a minor legal inconvenience. It carries real prison time, ruinous financial damages, and permanent public disgrace. By the summer of 1778, both men, Shaw and Marvin, whose only offense was reporting what they'd seen to the body that had authority over it, are sitting in jail, awaiting trial, facing a plaintiff with standing and connections against 2 junior officers with almost none. On January 2nd, 1778, before any of that legal drama resolves, Congress formally dismisses Esky Hopkins from the service entirely. The practical end of the naval career that began this whole raid. But the case against Shaw and Marvin is still very much alive, still working its way through Rhode Island's courts, and Congress is about to be forced to decide, for the first time in American history, what it actually owes to the people who report wrongdoing inside its own ranks.
I think that's really important. Discovering the foundation of where a lot of these things came from and the actions that led up to them provide a lot of insight as to how we established as a nation. Going back and seeing English common law or different interactions with the tribes that we've had, some friendly, some violent, but how that shaped us as a culture and what we valued. And this was no exception. And I really find that fascinating, how the individual actions of people led to some pretty sweeping conventions going forward. As you were talking about the criminal libel laws, I'm like, oh, I hope I haven't said anything on this podcast to besmirch either you, Dale, or somebody who is much more litigious. So far, so good. I don't think we have the level of punishment for that as was back then. But it's another dimension of this raid and what it yielded and what came from it. And like you said, there's a celebrated version, and then there's one that's a little bit more rough when you look at the edges of what actually happened, the failures that came about, the difficulty and the overreach that took place, and the consequences of all of that. Something we can all learn from.
What happens next is the part of this story that has almost nothing to do with naval tactics and everything to do with what kind of country the United States was choosing to become. And it's the reason this raid is worth remembering on the 4th of July rather than despite it. On July 30th, 1778, the Continental Congress takes up the case of Samuel Shaw and Richard Marvin, the two officers still sitting in a Rhode Island jail, sued for libel by Esky Hopkins for reporting his mistreatment of prisoners of war. Congress does something no government has formally done before in the American experiment. It passes a unanimous resolution declaring, in language you can still read in the congressional records today, quote, that it is the duty of all persons in the service of the United States, as well as all other the inhabitants thereof, to give the earliest information to Congress or other proper authority of any misconduct, frauds, or misdemeanors committed by any officers or persons in the service of those states. Congress goes further than a statement of principle. It agrees to defend Shaw and Marvin's lawsuit directly and to cover their legal expenses out of the public treasury. A Rhode Island attorney named William Channing is paid over $1,400 by Congress for their defense the following year. This is the first whistleblower protection law in American history, and it exists because two junior naval officers chose to report what they saw aboard a warship called the Warren, and because the country they served, barely 2 years into its own existence, decided at real political cost to stand behind them rather than the more senior, more connected man who wanted them silenced. If you're listening to this around the 4th of July, that timing isn't incidental. Everything in this story, the desperate improvisation, the real failure sitting right alongside the real accomplishments, the willingness to hold even a commander-in-chief accountable when the evidence demanded it, happened in the months before independence was ever formally declared. The country that would sign that document in July was already in March, capable of both the mission and the mess. This is not a footnote to the founding. It's part of the same story. Trace that all the way back and it runs directly through the raid you've just heard the whole story of. No Nassau raid. No gunpowder crisis to solve. No Esky Hopkins in command of a fleet in the first place. No Hopkins in command. No pattern of misconduct for two of his own officers to witness and eventually report. No court case. No congressional resolution. No first whistleblower law. History rarely hands you a clean, single cause chain like that. This one is about as clean as they come. There's a secondary legacy worth naming plainly, because it's the one most people actually associate with the story when they've heard of it at all. This raid is formally and permanently the first amphibious landing in the history of the United States Marine Corps, an institution that will go on to define that exact form of warfare for the next 2.5 centuries, from the beaches of Tarawa to the shores of Ichon. And it's the first fleet action ever fought by a continental navy that would, in less than 200 years, become the most powerful naval force this world has ever seen. Both of these institutions took their very first operational steps together, awkwardly, imperfectly, on a beach and in a channel most Americans still couldn't find on a map. So let's name the man this raid really cost. Because that's what we try to do at the close of every one of these episodes. Not just the tally of guns and barrels, but the people. Lieutenant John Fitzpatrick, commander of the Marine Detachment aboard the brig. Cabot was killed in the fight against HMS Glasgow, off Block Island on April 6, 1776. Not stepping onto a beach in the operation that made history, but aboard ship, in a lopsided gunnery duel on the voyage home. He is remembered as the best the historical record allows, as the first Marine ever killed in combat in the history of the Corps he served. 10 other Americans died alongside him in that same engagement, most of their names lost to the kind of incomplete record keeping that swallows up enlisted men more often than officers, in a war that was still finding its footing and its paperwork at the same time it was finding its fights. This raid gets almost none of the recognition of Bunker Hill or Yorktown, and it's worth asking honestly why that is. Part of it is that the mission's headline objective, the gunpowder, was mostly lost to a governor's midnight gamble and an unwatched channel, which makes for an awkward story next to a clean victory. Part of it is that the raid's most consequential outcomes, a whistleblower law, a disgraced commodore, a junior officer's first command, read more like courtroom drama than battlefield glory. And courtroom drama has never sold as many history books as Cannon Fire. But if you're looking for the moment the United States Navy and Marine Corps actually became what they would spend the next 250 years being, imperfect, improvised, capable of real failure, and still, when it mattered, willing to hold their own account, you could not do a lot worse than starting here, 4 months before anyone had signed the document that made any of it official.
Well said. I have family members that both served in both the Marines and the Navy, and I know the traditions that were established from the get-go, like you were just talking about, get refined over 200 years later, and when they give account of, and similarly as you've given account on the podcast and just personally, it's incredible to see how far we've come from a relatively unstable, like imperfect, I think the word that you used is the exact one that should be used, imperfect roots, but the iterative process, the refining the, not that we're perfect, but that we're aiming to be better with each go, with each learning opportunity. That's very impressive. And you're right, this could have gone so much worse. But knowing what honor is and what duty calls for, I think are the hallmarks of what symbolize the Navy and the Marines.
All right, well, that's all I got for you today, buddy. Why don't you take us out?
All right. Thank you, Captain. Listeners, thank you so much for hanging in there with us and learning, hopefully, something new today, like I have. If you ever want to get a hold of us, there are ways to do that. You could tell us, hey, thank you for this podcast and happy birthday, America. We'd be happy to receive your note. You can do that in a couple of ways. You can email us. The email address is ushistorypodcast@gmail.com. We're also on X Twitter with the handles nhistorypod. And in the show notes, you will find a link to a Discord server where you can also tell us that, but we can easily reply. I think that seems like the easiest communication. Maybe not. Whatever floats your boat. No pun intended, because this is a Navy podcast. Go ahead and reach out. And if you would, I know I'm asking a lot of you, share the show. Tell somebody you know that you think might benefit or be interested in this subject matter. Tell them about us and let them know that they could learn too, or they could re-experience. Maybe we're going to talk about something that they were involved in and their minds will be blown. It'll be great. And while you're there, please rate and review. Let us know what you enjoyed and what you'd like to see more of.
With that, we're going to wish you guys fair winds and following seas. Goodbye.
Bye.